Hi guys, welcome to the watercolor demo. I'm going to be flipping my camera over so you can see my paper and my palette. Email me if you have any questions about these techniques. They are due on February 2nd by midnight. You will notice under course content there's a folder called watercolor techniques. Just click on that, click on the assignment, and that's where you'll upload your video. All right, so I'm going to flip my camera so you're going to see my palette, which, as we talked about in the meeting this afternoon, those of you that made it, I like to use a ceramic plate. It spreads out the paint nicely, as you can see over there. Spreads out the paint. You can see how much pigment is in it. You can also, if you used a plastic palette, your watercolor tends to kind of bead up on the surface. So the ceramic plate works really well to do big washes. All right, and here is my piece of watercolor paper. You always want to tape your watercolor paper down on all four sides because good watercolor paper is 100% cotton, and so when you put water on it, it's gonna swell when it's wet, and then as it's drying, if it doesn't have the tape next to it to hold it down, it's gonna stay warped, and you're gonna have a mountain and valley painting, which we don't necessarily want. If that ever does happen to you, let me know, and we could fix it. There are several ways to do that. But for now, I'm just going to go over these watercolor techniques, which are listed under that watercolor techniques folder on Blackboard. So we're going to start with wet on dry, and that just means normal painting. That means the paper is dry and our paint is wet. So I'm just going to go to my my palette, sorry. I'm going to pick up some color. This is phthalo blue mixed with lemon yellow. And you can do any shape you want. That's just normal painting. So I'm doing a rectangle. Earlier I did circles. For now, we'll just do a nice little rectangle that's not completely perfect. So dry paper, wet paint. Wet on wet is where I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to wet the paper with clean water, or as clean water I have in my cup. There's a little bit of a tint to it, and that's okay. So what I want you to experiment with is just how the watercolor spreads when you drop it in. Notice how it looks like fireworks. That's great. That's exactly what it's supposed to look like. If it doesn't, that means there's not enough water on it. So the nice thing about watercolor is you can tilt your paper and you could influence the direction of the paint. You can also mix color this way. Okay, so that's wet into wet. Dry brush means we're gonna have dry paper and a dry brush. So that doesn't mean just pick up a brush off the table without dipping it in water first. It needs to have some dampness to it. So I cleaned my brush, I dab it on my paper towel, and I'm gonna go to my palette here and pick up whatever color I have or want to put on my paper. And notice how I'm tapping, I don't know if you can see, I'm tapping my paintbrush to get a lot of that excess water off. I'm gonna go back to my paper. You should hear a scraping sound. Notice that I'm using the side of my brush, not the tip of my brush. I'm not going like this because that's gonna make lines. I'm using the side of my brush and just barely touching the piece of paper. It's creating a really nice texture. That's great for brick, for grass, for sand, for bushes, anything like that that needs texture. Lifting is the next one. So for lifting, you can put down any color. Let me put down some ultramarine, which is one of my favorites to use. So I'm gonna put down a rectangle. And then I'm going to take a dry brush, so I'm cleaning my brush, I'm drying it off on my paper towel, and then I just want you to experiment with what happens when you run a dry brush over something that's wet. It does lift a lot of the color, but you'll notice that a lot of times it doesn't lift all the way to the white of the paper, and that's just the nature of watercolor. Once it sits on the paper, it does soak into it. It stains the paper. So in watercolor, you do need to plan That's why we're going to do sketches for all of our projects, and they're going to be approved by me so that you're not changing things in the middle of painting, because in watercolor that can't necessarily happen. Okay, so in wet into wet, let's see, I already did wet into wet. Why? This is supposed to be scumbling. I apologize. I'm gonna erase that really quick. This is supposed to be scumbling. And what that means is it's an irregular way of putting marks down on paper. So rather than like in wet on dry, I had nice long brush strokes. In scumbling, I like to use X's, or you can do circles, kind of swirls. Basically, you're filling in space without, while leaving white areas. Okay, so you're leaving some of the paper visible. You can layer this. You can let this dry, then put some yellow on it, then put some darker green, some blues, and make it look like a tree, the top of a tree or a bush. So scumbling is irregular mark making, leaving areas of white. Softening is, oops. Softening is when you're creating basically a gradient within an object, or allowing the edge of an object to be soft. So I'm gonna take this green that I have. So I want you to do this in two ways. I want you to make a C shape, and you're gonna basically create a sphere by softening the inside. So you're gonna make a C shape, you're gonna clean your brush, dab it on your paper towel, and then with the side of the tip of the brush, you're going to gently smooth out the inside of that circle. I'm gonna clean my brush again, because as I'm doing that, I'm lifting paint into my bristles. Okay, a nice soft edge on the inside. So you're gonna do a circle like that, and then I also want you to soften the bottom of this line, of a line. So I cleaned my brush, I dabbed it on my paper towel, then with just the side of my brush, I'm very gently softening that bottom edge. With softening, make sure you're not using too much water on your brush, because if you have a glob of water down here, it can shoot back up into this area that's already starting to dry, and that's going to create what's called a water burst. And we'll talk about that later. I'll show you some examples of that. All right, and the last one we're going to do here is called pushing out pigment. Before I lift, I'm going to lift my board so that it's angled for the washes, which I will show you in just a second. So all of these have been done with the paper flat, and that's because gravity is going to play into how we paint in watercolor. If you hold your board upright, all the water is gonna pool to the bottom, and your color is gonna pool to the bottom. So we don't necessarily want that when we're painting just normally, but in washes we do. So pushing out pigment can be used for grass or feathers, the end of hair. I'm gonna use this really pretty blue. This is phthalo blue. So I'm laying down a brush stroke, and then I'm gonna clean my brush. I'm gonna kind of dab it on my paper towel a few times, and then I'm gonna grab it, and I'm kind of flicking my wrist and pushing the pigment away from that spot. So I'm gonna jump to the other side. So it's kind of a mixture of a few of these. There's kind of some dry brushing going on, there's some wet on dry, and you could add in softening if you wanted to soften some of these edges. But that's pushing out pigment. All right, so let me elevate my board here for a second. Let's see. Okay. So this technique is called follow the bead. What that means is I'm just going to use this green color again because I have it on my painting. I'm going to switch sides real quick. I think you'll be able to see that a little bit better. Okay, so in a solid wash, I'm going to put 2 brush strokes down on top of one another. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a bead of water. Every time I put a brush stroke down in a solid wash, I'm going to load my brush with more paint. So I'm going to grab the bead and I'm going to pull it in the other direction. Notice this pool of pigment, that is our bead. We're going to grab it and we're going to pull in the opposite direction. So I ended up here. So I'm going to pull this way. I still have a really nice bead. I'm going to keep loading my brush every time. Otherwise, if I don't load my brush every time, I'm going to end up with a graded wash. Okay. So in a little area like this doesn't seem like it's really necessary because I can just use a big brush. But if you can imagine that this is a really big piece of paper and you don't have a huge brush, you're going to want to use this follow the bead technique. So when there is this line of dark paint at the bottom, that's because we're raising the end of my board. You're going to take a dry brush and you're going to just gently dab, and that paint will go back into the end of my brush. Okay, that way you don't have a line of dark pigment that's going to dry at the bottom. So with a graded wash, it's the same idea. You're going to load your paintbrush. I'm going to put 2 brush strokes on top of each other. Okay, then I'm going to grab the bead. I'm going to pull it the other way. I still have a nice bead here. But with a graded wash, that means going from a dark color to a lighter color. So every time I'm going to add water to my wash that's on my palette, so that when I go to the paper, it's slowly going to start getting lighter. Okay. And then again, I can take my dry brush and kind of dab to pick up that excess paint. So these are the techniques that are due Tuesday, February 2nd by midnight. Let me know if you have any questions.